Thank you for coming to this first talk of our 2022 speaker series. I'm Sam Stevens. I'm a trustee with the Trent House Association, which is the stewards for the 1719 William Trent House Museum in Trenton, New Jersey. And we're delighted to have Karelle Hall give our first talk, and I will tell you a little bit more about her in just a minute. And this is the William Trent House Museum. If you've not seen it, it is on about a 2-acre plot of land, as I mentioned, in the midst of state parking lots, office buildings, and highways just off Market Street. It was built in 1719 by William Trent, who was the Philadelphia merchant. It sits on the ancestral lands of the Lenape people who lived here for thousands of years. And we know during the colonial era and early federal period, many were removed west and north. Some did remain here in our continuing historical tribal communities. So we acknowledge the Lenape as the original people of this land, and that they have a continuing relationship with our territory here in New Jersey. I want to share our mission. Oops, sorry about that. Which is kind of illustrated here by this whole set of images. Our mission is to share the authentic history of the house, the property, and the people with our community, connecting the past with the present and tomorrow. We feel that we are serving as kind of a window on the history of Trenton and the history of the United States. Trent's land was originally 1,000 acres, so it really encompassed a lot of what is Trenton today. And many people and eras touched on the Trent House.
See view options. We can make it small, exit full screen.
Okay, I'm going to try to mute.
Now you can get to your sound adjustment. That's it.
Sorry, I'm going to get back to our introduction here. So I'm going to turn this over for now to Princess Hoglin, who is president of the Trent House Association. She has her doctorate in educational leadership and a master's in business administration. Thank you, Princess.
Thank you so much, Sam. And hello, as Sam mentioned, I'm Dr. Princess Hoglin, president of the Trent House Association, stewards of the 1719 William Trent House Museum. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for Ties That Bind, Nanticoke and Lenape Language and Revitalization, and sharing with us the opportunity to learn about who we are as Americans and human beings. Our gathering represents the importance of learning our inclusive history and acknowledging our triumphs as well as our traumas, our resiliency, as well as our hardships. Only through our connections and acknowledgements can we begin the conciliation and healing processes that will bind and strengthen us. Welcome. And thank you, Karelle Hall, for what I anticipate to be an informative presentation.
Thank you, Princess. And I also want to share our thanks with our many donors and funders, many individuals, and then we are also grateful to our corporate sponsors and to the state and other organizations that provide us grant funding. If you would like to donate, feel free to go on our website and use PayPal, and I have the link there, or you can send a check to us. And all that information is on our website, williamtrenthouse.org. And please stay in touch with us to find out about upcoming programs. We have a website which has a events tab so you can see what's coming up. We have a newsletter that comes out periodically, and we post on Facebook. So join us in any of those ways. Now I'd like to introduce Karelle Hall, who is our speaker today. Karelle is a PhD student in anthropology at Rutgers. And she has a BA already in anthropology and Native American studies from Dartmouth College. She specializes in language and cultural revitalization, among other things, and is a member of the Nanticoke Indian Tribe. She's received a number of awards and scholarships from Rutgers, from the American Ethnological Society and the American Philosophical Society, and has presented at conferences held by University of Pennsylvania, the American Anthropology Association, and the New Jersey Historical Commission. And I'm very proud and pleased to say that she is a member of a team working with us to develop plans for the Trent House to interpret Native American history and experience in New Jersey. So Karelle, I'm going to stop my sharing and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that. And I just would like to start with a greeting to you, all of you. We Canal Wilchmo, Karelle Delawens, Nanticoke. So it's good to see all of you. And in this case, I can actually see many of you or your names, and I'm very excited about that. My name is Karelle Hall, and I am a Nanticoke and a PhD candidate at Rutgers University. So today I'm going to be sharing a little with you about Nanticoke and Lenape history and revitalization, specifically about language revitalization. So I'm going to just start sharing my screen here. All right. So I want to start off with a brief history and geography of Lenapehoking. So pre-colonial Lenapehoking was not one single political nation, but made up of fluid sovereignties between different communities that were connected by shared kinship, history, culture, territory, political affiliations, and language. And throughout the ongoing colonial period, these sovereignties and the ways that Lenape people politically organized have shifted and evolved to address these changing political situations. So I have a couple of images here to start with. On the left-hand side of the screen is a colored image of pre-colonial Lenapehoking territory, which, as you can see, encompasses what is all of New Jersey, and we have Eastern Pennsylvania, parts of New York, and Delaware as well. And the shades of color that you see are representing the different languages that are being spoken here, because there are some variations between the languages that are spoken by the Lenape people. So in the north is the Muncie dialect, and you have a Northern Unami, or sometimes called Unalaktico dialect, and the Southern Unami dialect. And then on the right-hand side, you have the traditional Nanticoke territory, which, as you can see, spans the Nanticoke River and its tributaries on the eastern shore of the Delmarva Peninsula. The Nanticoke people trace their ancient ancestry to the Lenape, and this is reflected in the similarities between their languages. The word Nanticoke means people of the tidewater. These rivers, bays, and waterways were lifelines that connected the people. And today we're going to talk about some of those connections. So one of these connections that I'd like to start with is the role of wampum, particularly in treaty making and trade and political and social relationships. So wampum, firstly, is made from clamshells. So, and they are carved into beads that are strung into either single strands or woven into large belts like the one that you can see pictured here. So many coastal Algonquin communities would collect these wampum shells and create these beads, and they would trade them to other communities, including Six Nations, or who you may know as the Iroquois people. So these wampum strings were often used to accompany very important agreements or messages or teachings, and they represented a representation of sincerity and truthfulness and power behind these agreements. And so wampum belts were woven with white and purple beads to create different images. And so these images would both reflect the natures of the treaties that were being made between these different nations. And when the colonizers arrived, they were initially enveloped into this tradition of treaties as wampum belts. And so the one I have pictured here is the Penn Treaty belt, which was created between William Penn and Lenape Chief Tamanin. And so this belt is representing a friendship between the colonial settlers and the Lenape people. And there were many treaties and wampum belts that were exchanged. So for the settlers, these written treaties were the laws of the land, what provided that sincerity to these agreements. And for the Lenape people, they were these wampum belts. And so you see in a lot of these early treaties, there would be a written treaty and a wampum belt that would be paired together to create these binding contracts between these different nations. However, as we know, these relationships very quickly deteriorated. And so this treaty that was signed in around 1682 or 1683 in Shakamoxon, which is today Philadelphia, one generation later, in 1737, a new agreement was created. However, the relationship in this new agreement was not with the same open nature of friendship. And so in 1737, we have the walking purchase that was orchestrated by the sons of William Penn. Now, walking purchases are, they had been used as ways of dividing territory. And so the agreements would be, they would cede the territory that could be as far as a man could walk in a day, or whatever was agreed upon. But this particular walking purchase in 1737, the sons of William Penn became increasingly greedy and wanting to get more land from the Lenape. And so they agreed to a walking purchase. However, when the time came to actually measure that distance, they actually hired sprinters who could run that distance, and they cleared some of the brush from the forest on the paths that they were going to take, so that they were able to swindle their way out of much more land than had originally been agreed upon. And so as the settlers' greed continued to grow, many Nanticoke and Lenape people, their communities forged together and created new political alliances with each other and also with the Six Nations in order to keep hold of their land and their ways of life. After more than a century of conflict and land theft, however, they were compelled to begin to agree to reservation territories as one way to preserve their homes. So some of you may be familiar with the concept of Indian reservations in the western part of this country, but did you know that there used to be a reservation in New Jersey? So in 1758, the Brotherton Reservation was created for a Lenape community in what is today Burlington County, New Jersey. And so this lasted for about 50 years or so, but the increasing pressure from the settlers looking to take more and more land and to establish their new colonial governments really closed in around the community on this reservation to the point that they were no longer able to maintain their lives on it. And so around 1801 or 1802, many of the Lenape individuals from this reservation left to join other Lenape that had moved up into Oneida territory, which are part of the Six Nations. And then many of them traveled to from Oneida to Wisconsin, where they reside today and make up the core of the Stockbridge-Muncie community that is there today. The Nanticoke people also had reservations in Maryland and Delaware. There was a reservation near Chacon, which is near Vienna, Maryland today, which is right on the shores of the Nanticoke River. Another one was created in Broad Creek, which is near Laurel, Delaware, which is another larger tributary to the Nanticoke River. And then near Indian River, which is today Millsboro, and where the Nanticoke tribe today is centrally located, there was another reservation that was created. But these tracts of land, although they were large enough to hold the villages of these communities, they weren't nearly large enough to actually allow them to hunt and maintain a subsistence in their lifestyles. And so you would often see these Nanticoke people would leave on short hunting trips away from their villages so that they could collect food for their families. And then they would return and find settlers squatting on their reservation lands. And then the colonial governments in place, like refusing to enforce the treaty agreements and the boundaries of the reservations that had been set aside for them. And so you see then by the mid to late 1700s, as these relationships between the ever expanding colonial empire and the Lenape people and the Nanticoke people continues to deteriorate, many of them were forced northwards and westwards. So this map is showing a little bit more of the details of those westward and northward movements. And so you have Lenape people being pushed westward into Oklahoma, the ones going into Wisconsin, and several ending up in Ontario, Canada, forming Lenape communities, and some that have joined Six Nations. Today, the red marks that you can see on this map are indicating where the federally recognized communities are today. So there are 2 Lenape federally recognized communities in Oklahoma, there's 1 in Wisconsin, and there are 2 in Ontario, Canada. And then the third one up in Ontario is representing the Six Nations. However, not all Nanticoke and Lenape people chose to leave. A group stayed behind in the homelands, and those who did carved out a resilient existence on the edges of this ever-expanding colonial empire. So the communities that stayed formed their own, they came together and they formed communities that are today recognized by the states that they reside in. So in Delaware, there are 2 tribal nations that are recognized by the state, the Lenape Indian Tribe of Delaware and the Nanticoke Indian Tribe. And in New Jersey, there are 3 tribes that are recognized by the state, the Ramapo Lenape Indian Nation, the Powhatan Lenape Nation, and the Nanticoke Lenape Nation. And particularly the Nanticoke Lenape of New Jersey, the Lenape and Delaware, and the Nanticoke tribe maintained very close relationships with each other, intermarrying to the point where it's one large kinship connection between them. So today, Lenape is made up of several different communities that are spread across Turtle Island, what is today the United States and Canada. And their sovereignties are both fractured and connected through this long and ongoing violent history. So to the point where you have federally recognized tribes in the US, you have state recognized tribes, you have tribes recognized in Canada as well as numerous unrecognized Lenape people with various forms of political and social organization. Each of these communities have their own political governance that's shaped and or limited by the type of recognition that they have, whether that be federal recognition by the US or by Canada, or state recognition, or those who find themselves under another Indigenous jurisdiction, such as the Six Nations. And each of these communities also have their own orientations towards Lenape identity. For example, what I mean by this is that each of these communities have different resources and archives that they are using for language revitalization. There are different communities that hold certain songs and ceremonies that are known for Lenape, that are historically Lenape. There are communities that have residence in or different access to the homelands and to ancestral sites, as well as different access to treaty rights or NAGPRA claims, which are the Native American graves and protection and repatriation. So these are just a few examples. And each of these Lenape communities have a different relationship with each other, whether that be collaborative or conflicting. There are so many different aspirations about what Lenape identity, political existence, and land mean to each of these communities today and what it means in the future. So one way that we can look at an aspiration of Lenape Hoking is to look at the first United Lenape Nations powwow that took place in 2018 in Manhattan. So this was an event that was organized and attended by Lenape people from both the US and Canada, from both federally and state recognized tribes. They all came together to represent Lenape Hoking, not as one political nation, but multiple nations, all Lenape, recognizing their shared history, language, and cultural affiliation, and finding ways to come together and strengthen their ties. Also in attendance were other federally and state recognized tribal nations, including Haudenosaunee people, also called Six Nations or Iroquois, and other Indigenous peoples such as the Taino, who are coming from the Caribbean, and other allies as well. And they all came to dance together in the Lenape homelands and to forge a path forward together. They're asserting their Indigenous identities, specifically a Lenape identity that's being defined on their own terms, a declaration that we are still here, different nations coming together through this shared Lenape identity. Another way that we can think about this aspiration of Lenape identity and Lenape Hoking is through language revitalization. So Lenape languages are part of the broad Algonquin language family that stretches down the eastern seaboard through the Great Lakes and across much of Canada. And it's represented by the orange shading here. And on the right, there's a list of the communities that are all part of this broad language family. The Lenape are often seen by many of these communities to be the grandfathers of Algonquin-speaking people, to be that oldest community that the other ones come from. And some people from these communities argue that, maybe the family should actually be better represented by being called the Lenape language family rather than the Algonquin language family. But today, we commonly, when we're thinking about Algonquian languages, that's how we refer to them. But it is interesting to think about how these ideas came about. And so the Algonquin community was part of this language family, and on the East Coast. So when you had the settlers first arrive, meeting these people who speak this language, and then continuing to meet other people who speak a language that is similar, they're like, okay, these are Algonquin languages. But for Lenape people to be the grandfathers of them, even if they weren't the first people that the settlers came into contact with, then this is a different way to think about how we organize and think about the ways in which these languages and these communities are connected to each other. So because these languages are so similar and often mutually intelligible, they can often help each other with revitalization work. So in the eastern part of the country, particularly as you see here along the eastern seaboard, tribal communities here often find kinship across their political distinctions, and but they're finding common ground over their either limited federal recognition or their shared erasure in contemporary American society, and also through their shared language family and similar challenges to language revitalization. So then we're going to look at, how do we revitalize these languages? What does that look like? How do you revitalize a language that either has very few speakers or perhaps none at all? So one way to do that is to rely on that big extended language family. Many of them have similar words and grammar structures. So the Lenape in Oklahoma have been documenting that and maintaining the Southern Unami language. And they began, recording elders who still spoke their language and worked with linguists to preserve and document their language. Speakers from both of those communities in Oklahoma worked collaboratively on this. And today they have an online talking dictionary that includes searchable words and grammar lessons and stories that you can hear the original audio from these first language Lenape speakers. In Canada, the Munsee language, that northern dialect, is also being preserved. And the Munsee people have been working with their elders and using archives of dictionaries that have been created to teach and to revitalize their language among the younger generations. Now, Nanticoke doesn't have any living first language speakers, and it hasn't for several generations. And our archives consist of a few vocabulary lists that were collected in the 1700s. And so how do you revitalize a language like that? It seems very daunting when you think about Nanticoke as this separate, isolated language or a separate community. But when you realize that it is connected to this broader language family and to the Lenape, that they are able to share archival resources and also rely on neighboring languages to borrow words that we don't have, or to use those words as frameworks and those grammar structures as frameworks to reconstruct different parts of our language that were not captured in the archives. So one way that you could do this is, so one example of this would be our word for my grandmother, which is nohkam. So nohkam is not a word that was listed in those dictionaries. However, it is a word that has been maintained by other communities, by Lenape, by other Eastern Algonquin communities. And so our talented linguist, who has been working very diligently with our community to help us through this and to bring the language back, has been, can explore those the other ways that grandmother is written across those languages, and to track the changes that we already know about the Nanticoke language to reconstruct what that original word was. And then in other cases, it's a simple matter of borrowing from languages. And so many communities are using these techniques to help build their language revitalization projects. So social and political relationships between different Lenape communities can also be observed through language revitalization. For example, an elder, Nora Thompson Dean, who was a knowledge carrier from the Delaware tribe in Oklahoma, worked to preserve and teach Unami, which is that Southern Lenape dialect, both in her Oklahoma community, but also she traveled to the Eastern communities in New Jersey, and she shared the language and fellowshipped with the other Lenape communities that she found there. She sought out Lenape communities that had both federal recognition and state recognition, helping to forge a kinship through the language. While on the other hand, today's tribal governments in Oklahoma, in the two Lenape communities in Oklahoma, do not currently have a political working relationship with the state recognized communities in New Jersey, although they are using some of the same overlapping resources and archives to revitalize their language. So there are many different ways in which these communities are connecting or coming into conflict through language revitalization. One interesting thing about this ongoing pandemic that we are all in is that it's also created a different opportunity for language revitalization and for new possibilities for collaboration between different communities, particularly communities that are geographically separate. So I am currently taking part in a virtual Munsee language class that is being taught by a teacher who is based in one of the Ontario communities, in the Munsee community. And it brings in students from both their community, which is Munsee or Nalahi, which is what they've called their community in their language. It also brings them from students from the other community, which is Moraviantown. There are students who are attending from the Stockbridge Munsee community in Wisconsin, from the Ramapo and Nanticoke communities in New Jersey, from Nanticoke, Unkachog, and Shinnecock communities from New York, as well as other Native and non-Native people who are living in the Lenape-Hoking territories. So while Munsee is the main language that's being taught in this space, many participants will also introduce their own regional introductions and compare the sort of differences and similarities between their languages and with Munsee. And so it's become one of these really interesting collaborative spaces that are bringing Lenape people and other people of that broader language family together to learn and to teach and to share with each other and to bolster each other's language revitalization projects. So this is one form of decolonization work, that it decenters this ideology of language revitalization as something that happens within bounded individual communities, and actually shows that Indigenous language revitalization is very diverse and very dynamic. So why should we revitalize our language? What type of value do they hold? Is it not just easier to speak one language that everyone else uses? It may be easy to think that, but today I want you to consider what our language revitalization is truly about. And so one thing that is important for us is our languages help to connect us, to reconnect us to our ancestors and to their worldviews, and to help strengthen our own worldviews. So for example, I want to give you the example of animacy to show the ways in which our worldviews are actually embedded within the language that we speak. So in English, in the English language and in this Western view of animacy, there is a hierarchy. So people are considered animate. They get he, she, they pronouns. They are given sort of personhood. And then you have below that, you have animals. And we could even rank, animals we know versus animals we don't. So, pets with names, sometimes pets will get a partial part of that personhood. And then many animals, particularly ones that are not directly tied to us, are often referred to with that inanimate pronoun, it. And then, of course, below that, you have plants that are considered alive, but not animate. However, in our Lenape languages, animacy is including a much broader part of our world. Much more of our world is viewed as animate besides people. And so the same pronouns that are used to talk about animate humans are also applied to animals and to plants and to celestial bodies and to water. And so I want you to think about, how does this change our worldview when we are speaking about and to other beings with animate and to recognize their personhood? How does that change the way we see and walk through the world? Another example I want to give is with the way that we talk about our siblings and our cousins. So in English, we have two words for that, right? We have the words for our siblings, and then we have words for our cousins. So we are sort of creating very specific distinctions between those relationships. However, in our Nanticoke language, we use the same words to refer to our siblings and to our cousins. And so I want you to think about what that does to change that relationship between those individuals. And so, language is really shaping the way that we organize our world and the way that we organize our relationships with each other. And you can also see that through the word Lenape itself. And so when you learn in the language that Lenape means the human beings or the people created by thought, it really talks about our spiritual, celestial existence. And then you have, when you learn what the names of, say, Muncie or Unami or Nanticoke or Nalahi mean, these are geographic locations of particular social political communities that show our physical connections to our homelands and our ties to where we live. And so learning our languages also helps us to more richly understand in a richer way how our people were both connected to each other and how they saw themselves and their places in the universe and their connections to other communities. Revitalizing our languages also works to heal the ongoing trauma from the genocide of our people and our cultures and our languages. So we often think about that physical violence of genocide, but the violence to our languages was just as severe. If we think about starting with the erasure and altering of the place names of Lenape Hoking. So now we live in places that are called New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and cities that even cities that maintain Lenape names like Hoboken, for example, are still being severed and from their actual connections to the Lenape people and the ways that the Lenape people use that land and connect to that land. And so the names exist, but for many of the residents of those spaces today, the connections to those Lenape people are, completely erased. And then later you have these, starting in the late 1800s, you have federal and church-run boarding schools that are taking children out of their communities, separating them, stripping them of their languages, their cultures, their families, with the goal of killing the Indian inside of them and saving the man. And so it was really an attempt to break these children's abilities to communicate with their families, to break tribal nations apart, to break their identity as Native people. And so many of the people coming out of these schools that continued in the US until the 1970s and in Canada until the 1990s, really created such a disconnect for people having to go through these schools. And so they are unable to speak their languages anymore. They're unable to communicate with their family members. They're unable to communicate with their communities. They have been instilled with these feelings of shame about their languages, about their Indian identities, and being forced to adopt American ideologies, both about society and about language. And so revitalizing our languages is a way to work towards healing that trauma and to also to decolonize the ways in which we think about and consider language. So I also do some research on these colonial ideologies of language and the ways in which language revitalization is confronting them. And so some examples of them are the ideology of linguistic nationalism, this idea that distinct nations have distinct languages. So you can see that in a lot of policies around the world as having, single nations having that one standard language that they speak, and the idea that that those languages are bordered in those spaces. However, the different dialects of Lenape that are being taught in these multiple Lenape communities are really decentering this idea of language and nationalism. And these communities are redefining for themselves where these languages are spoken and what their relationships are to the communities that speak them. Another ideology is this one of standardization, the idea that languages should have a homogeneous standard. So the Lenape the Lenape languages are being written down, and they're creating writing systems for them. There are separate writing systems for Unami and Munsi. However, even within them, there are different, community regional variations of them. And so the idea that these languages, because oral languages tend to, they have a fluidity to them. And when you begin to write them down, standardization becomes much more important. And so this is something that many of the communities are grappling with. As you write down a language, what happens to that variation that you hear in the oral language? So that's something that many people working on revitalization are confronting. Now, the idea of purism, the idea that languages should be very distinct, that they shouldn't have too many borrowed words, is one that many of the people in the Algonquin language communities are fighting against, because when I gave that example earlier, of many of these communities are sort of relying on each other's archives to help rebuild their own regional communities' languages. And the distinctions between the political communities are not nearly as clearly defined within the speech communities, within these languages. These languages are very similar. They have shared connections. The connections between them are often more blurred than formal linguists and who want to organize them into distinct and neat categories can see. And so maintaining this fluidity is one way to sort of decolonize the ways in which we consider language, as well as the idea that particularly Indigenous languages, they shouldn't change too much. Now, a language that is alive is constantly in motion. It's constantly adapting to new technologies and experiences. And the languages that we speak today, for like English, the big global languages that we speak, like English, Spanish, French, when we look at those, we realize, there's a lot of those borrowed words between them that exist. And the languages themselves, of course, are shifting through across different geographies and through time as well. If we use English as an example, Old English and contemporary English are completely two different languages right now, as well as the English that is spoken in the United States and the English that is spoken in Great Britain and in Australia are all distinct, are all different from each other. And yet, for many Indigenous languages, they're not given that same space and that same ability to be as fluid and to borrow languages, to borrow words from other languages and to create new ones. And so the work of language revitalization is also often this work to decolonize those rigid ideologies that hold, that don't allow them to breathe and to move and to change. And then one of the last examples of an ideology that is that this one of wordism, the idea that language is primarily about words. But one of the big parts of wanting to revitalize how we speak our languages is it goes beyond the words themselves. It's about the both the worldviews and those ways of shaping the world, like I gave you in the examples of the animacy or the ways we talk about our family. And for many communities, some of these aspects of language have actually been maintained even after the words have left. So for many Nanticoke people, they have not spoken the Nanticoke language in several generations. However, they are still using some of these Nanticoke ideologies even as they speak English. So one example of that is in the ways that we depart from each other. And so you will often hear Nanticoke or Lenape people choosing to say in English, "I'll see you later," or "I'll see you again," instead of using the word goodbye. And one of the reasons for this is that in our languages, goodbye has, we don't have this word for goodbye. Our words for departing from someone are always like, "I will see you again," or "I will see you later," and not with this finality that exists in goodbye. So even though they are not speaking these words in Lenape or in Nanticoke, those same expressions of the language are coming through even in English. And so there's so much more to language than exists just in the words. And when we can learn our language, we can better understand how our ancestors saw and understood it, how they walked through the world, and that helps us to create a bright path and future for those next generations. And so I'd like to end my presentation today by sharing with you all some of our language. So the word here, Katakitawakanan, means our language in Nanticoke. And here I've given you some words and phrases that are both in Nanticoke and in Munsee, just to show you some of what I have been describing as these similarities and connections between those languages. So you can see how close they are to each other. And so I know that you are all muted, but I want you to silently follow along with me as I teach you how to just say some greetings in our languages. So we'll start with the Nanticoke words for how are you. So it is Kola Malisha. Kola Malisha. And in Munsee, the way you would say that is Kiha Kola Malsi. Kiha Kola Malsi. And then to respond in Nanticoke, you would say Nola Malis, I am well. Nola Malis. Or alternatively in Munsee, you would say Ni Nola Malsi, I am well. Ni Nola Malsi. And then giving thanks is also a very important part of the language. And so I'm going to give you the Nanticoke word for thanks, which is Wanishi. Wanishi. And in Munsee, it is Anishik. Anishik. So you can see how similar these languages are. And I hope that you will take some of these words and practice them and to think about these, our indigenous languages here in Lenape Hoking. And so I want to say Wanishi to all of you for coming to my presentation, and I really look forward to answering some of your questions.
Thank you very much, Karelle. This was very, very exciting information. And we are recording it, so I am hoping that we will soon be able to share that on our website. I don't see any questions in the chat, so if you do have some, please put them there. in the meantime, I have a question, and that's related, and we've talked about this in our project, but related to the understanding of ownership of property, particularly of land. And how is that different than the European idea of ownership? And how was it expressed in language or in other ways that may have added to the challenges of maintaining promises that were made?
Thank you for that question. Yes, so I think many people are familiar with this Western framework of land ownership. So you have land that can be sort of surveyed and carved out and can be bought and sold. And then, of course, you have certain people who are allowed to own land and not allowed to own land, right? And so land becomes then a tool of political power and of economic power. And it's interesting, and I think often today we also still consider, like in our sort of modern American society, we often still think about land in these terms, this term about land as a tool, land as a resource. But so when we go back into our Lenape understandings of land, I can first tie it to that initial conversation that I had of animacy, right? And so it's shifting our relationship to the land. And so instead of thinking about the land as this resource and that has these, different things that can be extracted from it or that can be used as a tool to gain, certain points of power, you are in relationship with the land around you. The land is alive. And so you are living in an area, right? And so within the language, like when we talk about, for example, like I said, Nanticoke translates to people of the tidewaters. And so, we are living in these spaces that are these spaces between the land and the water. And this is where our homes are. These are where our ancestors are. This is where we are able to practice our traditions. We have, neighbors who may live on a different part of this land, and that's where they are making their homes, but the land itself is not being owned by these individual people, right? By these individual communities. It's not being, there are sort of spaces that we recognize that this is where, our territories are, and these are where your territories are. But the idea that you are drawing a line and saying that you cannot, if you think about like in England, you can't walk across this property, or you can't collect food from this part of from this part of the forest. Those aren't the ways in which we are, framing our understandings of the world and the land. And so I think that initially when you're looking at those treaty agreements, and you have these colonizers who are looking to take these tracts of land. And so in their idea, these tracts of land are going to be these spaces in which they're going to be able to, they could put a fence around it, right? And they have like complete control over everything that happens in that space, versus this idea that like the Lenape idea that they are, they're looking for land because they need space to build their villages and to grow food. And so, we are going to allow them space here, we're going to make space for them here to be able to do that, but not thinking about the land as something that can just be, that can just be used as a tool, if that makes sense.
They can't be transferred. Sounds like people, like it's our idea of ownership is the Western idea, seems to be much more around total control over a piece of property and being able, regardless of who else may have a relationship with that property, if we're the owner, we can decide what to do with it, whether to sell it or whatever. So that's interesting. Thank you. We have a question from you. We did have a question from your mother. Did you have a question? And I'm going to, I think you can, if you can unmute yourself, I hope. Hold on, let me find. There you go.
Mine was not a question. I just wanted to reiterate what I put in the chat, that I really feel that the presentation you gave, Karelle, really gives me optimism for the future of our tribes. I grew up, in an era where we, just did not know this information. And I am just so proud that your mother can learn from her daughter. So thank you so much for an excellent, excellent presentation.
You're welcome.
Ditto. Over here, there's a hand up. The name on the account is Linda, but I see a gentleman there.
Yeah, I apologize for that. That's my wife's name. Inadvertently, I went in on the Zoom and didn't change the name. I just want to say to you, young lady, I'm so proud to see, and I just want to say I love you for what you're doing for the people. I'm friends with Eileen DeFries, Autumn, a couple of people that sits on the commission, the state commission, and I'm actually Catawba, and which is like a Siouan speaking people, and so I've been around Yuri and Duncan Munson, and they're like very good friends of mine. And my nephew is Wayne Duncan, who is a Youngblood, part of Youngblood drum group. And so I just want to say I'm just so happy you've actually made this. I'm also retired Navy and a veteran disabled, and I just want to say that you make an elder very happy to see a young person like yourself presenting yourself like this. My question is there a Native American program at, you say you got Rutgers?
Yes.
Is there a Native American program there that you know of at that particular university?
So first of all, just thank you for your kind words. And Rutgers does not have a formal Native American program. It is, there are a couple of other Native American professors there who I've been able to meet and to really work with closely. There is an undergraduate group that is I think they're still working towards that formal recognition from the university. So Rutgers doesn't really have or hasn't built that infrastructure to support either Native American students at the college or a Native American program. However, they are working to, like individual departments, such as our American Studies department, is working to incorporate more Native American history and literature and politics into their curriculum. So in small places, there's some bright work and plenty of room for more.
If any time I could be of any help in helping to facilitate anything like that. I live in Somerville, New Jersey, and I just recently last year got some of the mayor to actually designate November as Native American Month with a proclamation. And so we're working on these things to try to help to we're still here, like you said, we have not gone anywhere, we're still here. And so if I can like maybe give you I'll send in the chat my email address, and if I can be of any assistance to you in any way, please let me know.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I will definitely take you up on that.
Thank you. Lado.
I did want to, yeah, thank you. And I did want to mention, while Rutgers may not yet have a formal Native American Studies program, Montclair State University has, I believe, just established a minor for its undergraduate students in Native American history. And so that is moving. And so there's that university that's going to do that. A couple of questions came up. So one is just about, do you know, or is there a place that people can learn more about the history of the written forms of the various Algonquin or Lenape languages?
Well, yes, okay. So if you are interested in learning more about the Unami Lenape language, I do recommend that you go to this website. You can just Google Lenape Talking Dictionary, and that will both take you to the interactive dictionary where you can learn the Lenape words themselves, but it also has information about how that work was done to get to the point where they are today with that online dictionary. For Nanticoke, we are actively working on a language book of the language itself that will hopefully be available soon. One of my co-authors and the linguist who has been working so hard with our Nanticoke community is on this call. I see Keith Cunningham. I just want to give him a brief shout out for all of the hard work that he's done to help us really, trace some of those linguistic connections and helping us to do some of that language reconstruction that I was describing. And so as far as looking for more archives about the written languages, for the most part, the written forms of these languages are newer, and so the archives are sort of being created. You have many communities that are working on language revitalization have information on their websites about that journey that they've been on, that shows what what resources that they have to work with, whether they are, dictionaries or recordings from elders. And each community often will have those resources listed on their websites. So there's not so much a central place that I can send you to find that information, but it may take a little bit of exploring different tribal communities, tribal websites.
Thanks. A couple of questions about supporting revitalization of languages. How can maybe people from the tribal communities get involved? I guess that's one question. And then how can those of us who are not native, what can we do to help?
That is a wonderful question. I love it. Taking those first steps to actually be interested in wanting to learn your language is important. And then, for many of you who are, say, not from a tribal community, but you are interested in helping to support tribal language revitalization programs, many of them are gladly accepting, donations to help this work. And so those are available on, you know, on those same, oh my goodness, on those same tribal websites. Like the book that we're writing, you know, we are accepting donations for that. If anyone wants information about that, I can make sure that we can sort of send that to you. And I guess I can work with Sam Stevens to get, you know, a way to like send an email list out to people. But also, you know, beyond your donations, I also think that another way to really help is use your connections. So if you are affiliated with a university, or you're affiliated with, you know, some other corporation that has resources that can, whether those be, you know, assuming we ever get out of quarantine with this pandemic, that have, you know, spaces that can be that tribal communities can come and use to teach these classes, or teacher training courses, or ways to produce materials. Like there are so many different other ways that people can use whatever type of profession they're in, or whatever type of connections that they have access to help support these programs. And so I encourage you, if you are like, to reach out to the local communities that you are, you know, interested in learning more about their projects, and, you know, seeing where you can find, you know, where your skills and where your connections can come in handy.
Thanks, great ideas. And you, we asked about, and you spoke about how non-Native people, non-tribal people can get involved in supporting revitalization. Is it okay, it was a question, is it okay for non-Indians to learn tribal languages? Is that appropriate?
Yeah, you know, so I think I mentioned in my presentation that I'm taking part in a Munsee language class that's being taught from our wonderful teacher who is in Ontario, from Munsee community up there. And in that class, there are both Native and non-Native participants. And so, you know, many of the non-Native participants became interested because they are living in Lenape and they want to, you know, learn more about the language of those people, of the people whose lands in which they reside. I do think it's, you know, a really important question for those of you who are interested in learning these languages, to ask yourself this question of, why do you want to learn them? And so I want you to think about what, because if you're interested because you know, it's something different and something that you know, that you think is cool, or that you since you are living in this land, you want to learn a little bit about your Indigenous neighbors, or you want to learn a little bit more about Indigenous history. And as you are thinking about, you know, what those reasons are for you wanting to learn the language, I also want you to keep in mind this history and the fact that many Indigenous people for generations have not had a choice to learn their language. And so to keep that respect when in your heads as you're considering this. And so for many of us, this is our, you know, this is our first opportunity to learn our languages that were violently stripped from us, that the US government has actively worked to destroy. And so for us, it's not just this, you know, really cool, exciting thing. These are, you know, very, very heavy and important matters to us. And so if you are someone on the outside, I'm not saying you can't walk into those spaces, but you need to walk into those spaces with a certain level of consciousness about, you know, what some of the weight of this is that you are walking into, and, you know, how you are going to be part of that, and to help to, you know, make this better, and to create this better future moving forward.
Thank you. Here's another question on a different topic. You mentioned that the languages in the Algonquin family or the Lenape family are similar, and you gave some examples at the very end. The question is, how much is it possible for people who speak one of those languages to understand each other? Is it pretty easy? Or does it vary depending on the specific language? Or what can you say about that?
Yeah, I would say that for many of them, they are mutually understandable. And so sometimes it could be as much as a difference in accent. So if you think about, you have if you think about those differences between like American English and British English, sometimes it's a bit of an accent difference, and sometimes the words themselves are different when you're thinking about like elevator and lift, or trainers and sneakers, things like that. You know, you see those same types of differences within these Algonquin languages as well. But our languages are very, they're descriptive. That's why a lot of our words tend to be very long when in comparison to, say, English words. And so when you break apart those words and you take those, the morphemes, which are those different little parts of the words, even if they are constructed, I'm going to give an example. So I'm not talking about it. So if we think about the word for bald eagle, in Nanticoke, that word is wapundup, or wapuntup. And that means essentially white head, because as we know, bald eagles have white heads. In Lenape, the word is opalanie, which actually means white tail. Now, wapuntup and opalanie sound like entirely different words. However, for people who speak those languages, they are going to recognize that one says, you know, white head, one says white tail, and that there's sort of regional differences in referring to that same animal. And so, so I think in those pre-colonial times, the communities, even though they had their own regional variations and sort of vowel shifts and things like that, they were still very much able to understand the neighboring communities' languages.
Great. We've got someone who mentioned a resource. The University of Oklahoma has a Native American Studies program. So that's a resource that someone for us. Someone wanted to know where the recording will be posted. It won't be immediate, but it will eventually be on the William Trent House website, which is williamtrenthouse.org, and we have a page for our videos, and that's where it will be. I'm looking to see if there are other sort of, okay, here we go. I'm looking to try to see all of the questions here. Is there instruction in elementary or secondary schools in any of the communities that you're aware of, Karelle, that teaches the indigenous languages of the areas? Is that true ever in Canada, for example? Is it true in Oklahoma? Do you know of any examples like that?
So I guess just for the speaker, just to clarify, do you mean our elementary school Native children in the communities like learning their language? Are there like sort of language schools or language immersion schools or language classes for those children, or are you asking if they are available for like school children?
Here's the question.
Okay.
Yeah, let me read the question. And I kind of got a garble there. Are there elementary or secondary schools where the language of instruction is that of the indigenous people of that area?
Got it. So the idea of the language immersion. You know, that is definitely a dream and a goal for many of our communities, to be able to have these, you know, schools where everything is primarily taught in the language, and having the immersion schools. So there are other indigenous communities that are doing this and have created this. For our communities in you know, in New Jersey and in Delaware, we are not there yet. However, we, and I know in Canada as well, and in New Jersey, they will sometimes have summer camps where they are doing the language. So they have, I do believe in one of the communities, they in Canada, I believe at Moravian Town, they are they hold a summer camp where they where part of that time is language immersion. So no English, try to speak the language as much as you can, and so having those little pockets of language immersion. And I know in New Jersey they've also been working on they've had summer camps for the children to also start to use the language. But as far as the, those full schools, like those language immersion preschools that some other Indigenous communities have been able to start, those don't yet exist in any of our local communities, but it is definitely, one of those things that's that hope for the future.
Great. Now we are running toward the end of our time. And I don't know, we had a lot of comments in the chat and some suggestions and so on. Did anyone not get their question answered? If you didn't, and you can unmute yourself to ask the question. One thing we did get a question about, Karelle, is whether you would be willing to share any contact information so people could follow up with you.
Absolutely.
Okay, so if you want to put it in the chat, people can see it. Would that be okay?
Yes, I will. I'll put my contact information in the chat.
Great. Anybody have a question that they didn't get a chance to didn't hear me say because I missed it, or I messed it up when I tried to communicate it? Got a lot of thanks, by the way, for from listeners who appreciated your presentation, as do we. I think that if you put your email in the chat.
Yep, I'm doing it right now.
Okay, then anybody can sort of, there it is, can grab it. And
Yes.
then it also has a place for you to go and communicate with the Nanticoke Language Project there.
Yes, so
So,
I put both emails in there. One for my email and then also the one for our Nanticoke Language Project specifically.
Okay. I don't see any other hands up or hear anyone, so I think that this will wrap it up. Oh, I hear somebody.
Oh, hi.
Is there someone?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Could
Oh, hi. Karelle, very nice presentation. I just wanted to know, did you grow up learning a lot about this information about your family, your Indigenous roots, or did you learn more as you got older?
Well, so my parents are actually on this call, and so as far as the language, most of the people, my mom also mentioned this briefly, most of our community members did not have access to most of the language beyond a word or two. And so that, so my knowledge in the language and working with it is something that I've only been doing in the past 10 years or so. But growing up, certainly I knew very much about my Nanticoke heritage, that, that I was Nanticoke and, who our people were and where we came from. That's something that, my mother made sure that, that we knew about ourselves. But, as an adult, being able to, actively work with our community on a lot of revitalization projects and some other cultural work, I am continuing to learn new things all the time.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see that Shirley Satterfield, excuse me, is on the phone, and I think she had her hand up at one point. Shirley,
Yes,
if
I
you have a
did. Thank you.
question.
Yes, thank you, Samuel. Thank you, Ms. Hall, very much for your presentation. I'm the historian of the African American community in Princeton, and I start actually with the history of the Lenape Native Americans who hollowed out the land between the Delaware River and the Raritan Valley, Kings Highway, actually, Route 27. And since the reason I start out with that is because Nassau Street is part of what has been hollowed out by the Native Americans. But I would like to talk with you. Oh, wait, somebody's talking. Okay. I would like to talk with you because more young people need to know about this. So I'm going to get your address and we'll have a conversation. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. I can't wait to talk with you more.
And I have to put in a plug then for the work that Karelle is doing with us at the Trent House. She and two other young women, Brianna D'Agostino and Trinity Norwood, are working with the Trent House to help us develop a framework or sort of a map for how to incorporate information and exhibits and programs related to the fact that Lenape people were here not in all of New Jersey, but also very specifically at the Trent House. We know that that was a site for settlement, and we've had a lot of archaeological evidence to support that. And so Karelle will be helping us work up that framework, and then we are hoping to produce some short introductory videos that can be shared with students and with anyone. So keep posted.
Yes, there are so many educators that have, reached out to us asking for, asking how can they teach more of Lenape history and Native American history in their curriculum? What can they do? And they're looking for things that they can give to sort of younger children. And so, this project that we're working on with the Trent House is, one way to provide, new and really useful resources for, for teachers to really get that information out there and to, expand their students' knowledge of America and specifically Lenape history and ongoing social and political life.
And thank you, Karelle, for being part of our team. I think we'll wrap it up for today. Thank you all so much for joining us and for the great comments and questions. Keep posted. We'll be putting up more information on future talks on a variety of subjects. So just keep checking us out. Thanks, everyone.